begin a discussion in terms of the introduction to philosophy, the first thing that we're going to need to do is actually just define what the term means. A lot of people have heard of the word philosophy before, but very few individuals really know the root meaning behind the term, as well as the major branches that will be discussed in philosophy as a discipline. The first thing that you need to know about philosophy is its etymology. Etymology is just a fancy word for discussing the origin of a term or its root meaning, what language the term or the word comes from. Hopefully, in knowing a little bit about the etymology of philosophy, you'll come to know a little bit more about how to define it and what philosophy means. The term or the word philosophy actually comes from two Greek words, philos or phileo on the one hand, and then sophos or sophia on the other. The first part, phileo or philos, is a word that you see in other disciplines, or a word that you might oftentimes encounter in just reading a map. Philadelphia, for example, or philanthropist, both terms begin with PHIL. The root word or the meaning of that original word in the Greek is just love. Philadelphia is known as the city of brotherly love. A philanthropist is someone who loves his fellow man. Those are two other Greek words. Sophos or Sophia is another Greek term or Greek word that literally just means wisdom. Sophos means wisdom. For example, if you're a second-year college student and you're referred to as a sophomore, that means that on the one hand you're supposed to be fairly wise. I hesitate to tell a student what the last portion or the last part of sophomore means, because oftentimes it's not taken all that well. More, from which we get the word moron in the Greek, just means dull. A sophomore is someone who supposedly has a lot of knowledge, but probably just enough to be dangerous. So philosophy as a term or as a word means love, literally, of wisdom, which unfortunately doesn't help us all that much, because I think that once somebody even understands or knows that the word philosophy means love of wisdom, the next question that comes to mind is, well, what is meant by that? What do you mean by wisdom? What does it mean to be a lover of wisdom? Actually, a person who was the first individual to use the term was an individual by the name of Pythagoras. Pythagoras is known for his Pythagorean theorem. He's known for mathematics. He's not oftentimes associated with philosophy, but he considered himself to be a philosopher. He was the first person to really coin the term and to use it. And he said, I'm like a spectator at some kind of gaming event. The Greeks were oftentimes having sporting events where individuals would be throwing javelins or running. And he said that that's kind of what takes place in terms of philosophy. That I'm not out on the field, I'm not running a race myself, but I'm out in the stands and I'm taking it all in. I'm a lover of wisdom. Maybe a better way to define the term is just to give some kind of a cursory or a general definition for what philosophy means. The way that we're going to be using the term in this course is philosophy is known as the study of fundamental issues. I think that's a little bit better than just saying that it's the love of wisdom. Unfortunately, it too raises probably just as many questions as it answers, because the first question that comes to mind when somebody says that philosophy is the study of fundamental issues is, well, what's a fundamental issue? An example of the kinds of things that I'm referring to in terms of being philosophically fundamental would be issues like, does God exist? What is the status of morality? Are morals relative or are they objective? Are they absolute? Are there these non-natural properties that exist in the world around you? What is the meaning of life? Why would God allow evil to exist? What's the nature of reality? Is reality made out of matter? Is there something more to the universe? These are all fundamental philosophical questions. Fundamental in the sense in which most individuals have asked these kinds of questions before, even if they don't agree as to what the answer is. Fundamental in the sense in which these are life-changing, life-altering questions. Much more important in the total, grand scheme of things than, well, what color of tie am I going to wear today, or even what kind of job ought I to pursue. They're fundamental in the sense in which they have the potential to make a huge impact, a huge difference in one's life. So for us, the study means philosophy as a study means the study of fundamental issues. It comes from that original Greek word or term, which means the love of wisdom. The next thing that we need to spend a few minutes talking about is just, well, what do we mean by a philosopher? Who is the supreme example of a philosopher? And there we have to turn to Socrates. Socrates lived in 470 BC, the date of his birth, and died around 399 BC. Most individuals are familiar with a few things about the life of Socrates. Probably the most important part of his life was the way that he died. He died by drinking hemlock. He was accused by the city officials in Athens of doing a couple of different things. First of all, he was accused of corrupting the youth, people like Plato and some of his friends, people like Cratylus, and some of the other cohorts of Plato that just loved spending time with Socrates. And he was also accused of teaching a belief in false gods. Socrates basically rejected the pantheon of gods that was embraced by most Greeks at that time, and believed in something that actually many scholars have argued is very close to a Judeo-Christian conception of God. Certainly not in the sense in which he would embrace a Christian worldview, but more along the lines of saying that he believed in there being just one ultimate reality. So he is condemned to die. Socrates made a name for himself by basically being a thorn in the side of those individuals who were in charge in Athens. What happened, and basically this is the way things worked in terms of education 2,500 years ago, was that an individual who'd be known as a sophist or a sophist, S-O-P-H-I-S-T, and by now you know the original meaning of that term, a wise man, would go from city to city, or polis to polis, a city region in ancient Greece, and basically offer up himself in terms of being a tutor for those individuals who came from wealthy aristocratic families. He would say, I'm going to be in town for the next couple of weeks, and if you have a man that would be worthy of being tutored, at that point they thought very little of the mental capacity of women. If you have a young male child who's worthy of being tutored, I'd be in town for the next couple of weeks and give lectures on justice or beauty or rhetoric, those sorts of things. Plato would be from that kind of family, and Plato would be the kind of individual that these sophists would probably key in on and probably spend a lot of time tutoring. Socrates, although he was not a sophist and actually rejected the term outright, Socrates himself claimed to know absolutely nothing, spent a lot of his time in his own trade, which was a stone cutter. He toiled for a long time and never actually made a lot of money doing those sorts of things. He spent a lot of his time just earning and eking out a living. But whenever he got a free chance, he always liked to spend some time asking questions of the sophists. Matter of fact, he was known for that method of inquiry, where he would ask questions. It's known as the Socratic method. Socrates thought that that was the best way to teach anybody anything, not by giving them a lecture, like what you're experiencing right now, but by trying to draw the information out from the student or from the pupil. And so he would go up to these sophists, these supposed or purported wise men. Somebody who, for example, like Parmenides, might come into town and say, I'm going to be giving a lecture on justice. And Socrates would ask the question, well, what do you mean by justice? I'm very interested in your topic. Could I possibly just find out what it is that you're going to be talking about? And so Parmenides, or whoever the sophist was, would oblige Socrates and say, well, this is how we're going to be defining justice in the next few weeks. And Socrates would always be quick to point out that there were holes or flaws in that definition. He would say, well, it seems to me like there are specific examples that wouldn't fit your definition. And he would give an example, and a sophist would respond by perhaps tweaking or changing his definition, at which point Socrates would say, but now it seems like instances of injustice would be able to count. And so the sophist would make a few further or additional modifications. And then finally, Socrates would point out that none of these definitions are working. The sophist usually by that point would be somewhat flustered and say, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't give a definition, I'll just give an example. And so he'd say, this is the kind of thing that I mean by justice. And Socrates would say, well, I think that that's kind of debatable too. And by the way, I didn't ask for an example, I asked for a definition. If you're going to be giving a talk or a discussion on justice, it certainly seems like at a minimum you need to know what you're talking about. Socrates obviously made a lot of enemies that way. Most of Plato's dialogues, and that's where we find the discourses between Socrates and these other sophists, end up with the sophists being somewhat upset, to put it mildly. Socrates himself wrote absolutely nothing. All that we know about Socrates is recorded in the writings of Plato, and Plato almost always uses Socrates as the main character, the main figure. He almost always comes out being the hero in his dialogues. So Socrates himself wrote nothing. Socrates himself is known more for his philosophy, more for his method of dialogue and inquiry, which is known as the Socratic method, than he really is known for perhaps some of his other theories. Most of his theories were developed later on by Plato, and as a matter of fact, that's one of the problems in reading both Plato and Socrates. Remember, Plato did all the writing, and Plato always used Socrates as his mouthpiece. So if you read some of Plato's dialogues, the first question you should ask is, in reading this discussion of Socrates, am I really reading what Socrates believed, or is Plato just putting words in the mouth of Socrates? Or is this probably just Plato's view. So that's known as the Socratic or the Platonic problem. Who really is doing the talking in Plato's dialogues? Socrates was not followed because he was an individual who, as I said before, was wealthy. He was not a wealthy individual. He was not followed because he was a particularly handsome man. There were poets during the time of Socrates that described him as being half man, half goat. He was said to have been extremely ugly with a pug nose. And so he wasn't followed because he was the most handsome individual on earth, or because he had gained a large following just because he was wealthy and powerful. I think most of the individuals who followed Socrates were like Plato. Youthful individuals who really enjoyed seeing Socrates put both sophists as well as the leaders in the town of Athens on the spot. And it's because of that, most likely, that Socrates was put to death. You can read about Socrates' trial in the Apology, which again is also written by Plato, one of Plato's earliest dialogues. And you'll see that in many ways Socrates condemned himself to die by some of the responses that he gave during his trial. The important thing that, at least at this point, that I want you to know about Socrates is that hopefully we hope to do the same sort of thing in this class. Not in terms of offending other individuals with our questions, but perhaps more along the lines of realizing that maybe the first step in coming to know something about philosophy is to ask questions. The other important element with respect to Socrates is to understand that he understood, or at least said that he understood, or knew very little. That's why he had such a big problem with the sophists. The sophists, in the very title that they carried with them, claimed to be wise or claimed to have a certain amount of wisdom. And Socrates, for the most part, wanted to rein in those claims and have individuals realize that they probably know a lot less than they really think that they know. And the things that they know, they really have no idea what they're talking about. There's a story that goes along with Socrates that there was an oracle of Delphi where there were some fumes or vapors that were coming off the top of a mountain that would be able to predict future events or be able to answer questions that were posed to that oracle. And as Greeks were wont to do, whenever you found vapors coming out of a mountain that oftentimes would result in people perhaps going a bit wacky on those fumes, the first thing that they thought that should probably be done is you want to send a priest up there and probably send a bunch of virgins up there to breathe those fumes. And that's exactly what happened at the Oracle of Delphi. You had a priest with a bunch of virgins breathing in these fumes, at which point they would, for the most part, get wacky on that junk and start to say gibberish. The priest would attempt to interpret that gibberish as a response to a question. One of Socrates' disciples or pupils, or somebody who followed Socrates, went up the mountain and posed the question before the oracle. He said, "Who's the wisest man alive?" or "Who's the wisest man that ever lived?" And surprise, surprise, oftentimes the oracle at Delphi, through the priest, was open to manipulation of sorts. Knowing that it was one of the followers of Socrates that posed this question, the response came back that the wisest person alive was Socrates. And the pupil was delighted at this, of course, and went traipsing back down the mountain and wanted to give this information to Socrates as soon as possible. Socrates actually, instead of being overjoyed at hearing the news that he's the wisest person that ever lived, it's actually recorded that he was somewhat puzzled by this response, because he claimed time and time again that he knew absolutely nothing. And so he found it rather odd, rather bizarre, that the oracle would have listed him as the smartest or the wisest person that ever lived. Until it dawned on him that perhaps the reason why the oracle at Delphi declared him the wisest was because he knew that he wasn't wise. Everyone else is going around thinking that they know the nature of things, when in reality they know nothing. At least Socrates knew that he knew nothing. And perhaps that's something else that we can take from Socrates as our example. Not so much to claim that we know absolutely nothing, because if you read the dialogues of Plato, you'll see that time and time again, actually, Socrates claims to know all kinds of things. And it would be foolish to claim that absolutely nothing can be known, something that we'll evaluate later on in the semester. But maybe the more prudent thing to do is to acknowledge that there are very few things that one can be absolutely certain of. And that maybe the easiest place or the best place to start in philosophy is to recognize that we need not be as dogmatic as perhaps we have been, but to be open to other worldviews, other ways of thinking. The phrase for which Socrates is perhaps most well known is "the unexamined life is not worth living." And that ultimately is going to be the catchphrase or the byline for this course. Because hopefully in this course, what we'll be able to do is to examine areas of your life and examine them in such a way as to find answers, again, to those ultimate or fundamental questions. If we don't ask the kinds of questions that Socrates was concerned in asking and try to at least attempt to find answers to those, Socrates would say that that's a life that's no different from some type of animal, that we're merely going through the motions, that we're getting up in the morning, that we're brushing our teeth, that we're eating a breakfast, we're going off to work, and we're coming home just to repeat the process until the day that we die. That's not a life that's worth living. That's not a life that's keyed in or focused in on those fundamental questions. And Socrates would say, ultimately, what we want to focus on are these fundamental key questions. That leads us to another portion in this information or this introduction to philosophy, and that is, what is the importance of philosophy? Why ought we to study philosophy? What's so good about knowing anything philosophically? The reason that I raise this is that oftentimes philosophers are thought of or are conceived of as individuals who live in ivory towers and write books or perhaps articles about things that nobody in their right mind would really care for reading about. There's a famous phrase associated with philosophy, that philosophy bakes no bread. In other words, that philosophy produces nothing that's tangible, nothing of worth. In any other discipline, it seems like you always are able to produce something that's useful, something that's practical. In other words, it doesn't appear like there's any cash value to philosophy, not in the sense in which you can make a living doing it, which, as an aside, most individuals would probably tell you that if you did want to pursue a graduate degree in philosophy, probably the first phrase that you'd want to learn is, do you want fries with that? That's not, unfortunately, the only thing that Socrates is referring to. He's wanting to point out, or individuals who use the phrase, philosophy bakes no bread, are wanting to point out that it really doesn't seem like there's a lot that's tangibly produced when one does philosophy. I have a couple of different responses to that claim or to that charge. The first one is that oftentimes that is the case. It's very possible to be involved in a philosophical discussion where it appears like absolutely nothing tangible is being produced. We want to steer clear from that. It's possible to do absolutely nothing in this class that's really of worth because you get involved in the minutiae of philosophy. Sometimes graduate students in philosophy, I think, are sometimes culpable or responsible for doing that very thing. We want to steer clear of that. My second response to philosophy bakes no bread is that even though sometimes at a surface level it may appear like we're not doing anything that's of worth or that has a lot of value, at a deeper level oftentimes it may. It may appear, for example, later on in this course like we're doing something that's really not worthwhile. And you may wonder, well, even if I can answer this question, what difference does it make? What I'm trying to tell you now is that at a deeper level it probably will make a lot of sense and it will be fundamentally important. For example, later on in the semester we're going to be discussing an individual by the name of George Berkeley, who was an Anglican archbishop who lived during the modern period, 17th, 18th century. And this individual claims that there's no such thing as matter, that there's no such thing as a mind-independent reality, that what typically we define or what we think or conceive of as matter would cease to exist if unperceived by some kind of mind. That seems really odd. It seems really bizarre to think that this desk, for example, would cease to exist if it were not perceived by some kind of a mind, that it's like just an image or a representation or some kind of mental thing. Most people, I think, would probably first recommend that Berkeley be placed in some kind of insane asylum, and that the last thing that you'd want to do is accept his philosophy or his approach. And even if he were saying something that was perhaps true, most people would say, well, what difference does it make? What we're going to see later on in the semester is that if Berkeley's correct here, that actually goes a long way in demonstrating or proving that God exists. Now, whether or not you think that a desk is composed of matter or some kind of mind-independent reality may not make that big of a difference to you. But whether or not one thinks that God exists, that makes a huge difference. Whether you be atheist or theist or agnostic, most individuals are going to admit that's a fundamental question. So at a fundamental level, it's extremely important. At the surface level, perhaps not. But you need to understand that many of the consequences or ramifications for something that appears trivial or insignificant is oftentimes far-reaching, and that it has an ultimate significance that's associated with it. So how do we respond to philosophy bakes no bread? The first response, sometimes so. We want to steer clear of those situations. Second response, not always the case. Oftentimes things that appear trivial or insignificant at a surface level, at a deeper level are much more important and really are fundamental. Thirdly, and most importantly, I think that even at a surface level, many things that we're going to be discussing, especially in this class, are going to be deemed fundamental. We're going to be breaking bread. Not a kind of tangible, corporeal, physical bread, not a material kind of bread, but we're going to be doing something that's ultimately much more important than even the food that we eat. Trying to attempt the question of what kind of being am I? Does God exist? What is the status of morality? These are fundamental questions, and these are the basic kinds of questions that we're going to hopefully have time to discuss this semester. The next thing that we need to discuss is the scope of philosophy. Another phrase that's sometimes associated with philosophy is the beard does not the philosopher make. The beard does not the philosopher make. What does that mean? Does it mean that women cannot be philosophers, except with the possible exception of maybe those women who are in circus or carnival freak shows, because you have to have some kind of a beard to be a philosopher? Obviously not. You don't want to take the phrase literally. And yet I think that oftentimes individuals are of the opinion that you have to look a specific way to be a philosopher. That, well, you can tell Dr. Krogman is a philosopher. I mean, my word, look at him, he has a beard. Sometimes the notions of a philosopher is someone who just kind of strokes his beard and thinks, philosophically, or looks bemused at points. The person just looks philosophical. Well, the first thing that obviously you need to know is that philosophers don't look a particular way. But I think what's probably more important about that key phrase, and what's really at the heart of the matter, is that you don't have to have a specific degree to be classified as a philosopher either. Nor do you have to even have had a class in philosophy before. Individuals who are watching this tape have thought about issues of, does God exist? Why does God allow evil to exist if God does exist? What am I? Am I going to survive death? What's the point of it all? What is the nature of reality around me? If you've asked these kinds of questions before, you've done philosophy. Most students have not had a class in philosophy before, not in an academic setting. We have classes in math and science and English and history from the time that we were in grade school, but most individuals typically don't encounter philosophical topics until they get to college. But that doesn't mean that you haven't been doing philosophy all along. You've been doing it in a non-academic setting, and perhaps you didn't know the rigorous sorts of arguments that might be usable to support or defend your position, or maybe even in some of the terms that might be used in some kind of philosophical contexts. But you were still doing philosophy. The beard does not the philosopher make. If you're living the examined life, you've been doing philosophy all along. And I point this out, I suppose, just to put the student at ease, to let you know that this is not something that you have to fear in any way, because, as I said before, in some sense, you've been doing philosophy all along. It's merely a matter of learning terms and perhaps being open, or at least experiencing alternate ways of thinking. The next thing that we need to discuss are some of the major branches, some of the major fields to philosophy. Understand that philosophy is the study of fundamental issues, that it is the love of wisdom, but that typically philosophy is broken down into four major areas. These four major areas will serve as the four main parts for the remainder of this semester, or for the remainder of this course. We're going to have, first of all, a branch discussing or detailing the study of reality. That's known as metaphysics. We're also going to have a branch or a field, an aspect of philosophy where we talk about the study of knowledge. That's epistemology. We're also going to look at issues in axiology. Axiology is the study of value. And then finally, another branch that we'll look at is the study of right reasoning, or the study of reasoning in general, and that's just the study of logic. What we need to understand is that all of these branches are intertwined and they're interrelated. And so at this point, even though I'm telling you that we're going to try to probably spend a short segment of our time dealing with reality, and then we'll move on to epistemology or to knowledge, and then to value or to ethics, in reality, you can't split them apart that way. Everything's intertwined. So I just want to, at this point, give you a little bit of background into each one of these areas to let you know exactly what I'm talking about when I refer to something being, for example, an epistemic or an epistemological issue. And then we'll talk a little bit more in detail as the semester progresses about what are some of the nuances or the specifics of each one of the disciplines. The first major branch is metaphysics. The word metaphysics, again, just like almost every word that we're going to look at in this class, is Greek in origin. In terms of its etymology, it comes from two Greek words. Meta, which is a Greek preposition. Greek prepositions can mean just about anything, depending upon their location and the way that they're used in a sentence. You can think of meta perhaps like a word that may have a double meaning in English. It can mean either after or beyond. Physics comes from the Greek word physika, and physika in the Greek just means physical, or it's come to refer to physical things today anyway. So the word metaphysics, even though it sounds like a highbrow term, when somebody says, oh, that's a metaphysical concept, immediately you think, oh my word, we're getting into a deep conversation here. Literally all that it means is after the physical, or it means beyond the physical. The word was not used by either Plato or Aristotle or Socrates, which is rather odd. If Plato were around here today and you could speak a little Greek to him and you were to ask him if he were familiar with the term metaphysics, he would say, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And yet that's a key or a core philosophical term. The reason why Plato and Socrates and others would be unfamiliar with the term is that the term was actually coined after their time. It was first used by an individual by the name of Andronicus, who was himself an editor in the Roman Empire. What happened was that Aristotle's works over time had been lost to antiquity, or at least they'd been scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And there was a call, there was a need to bring back all of Aristotle's works together and see if we couldn't keep Aristotle's works and keep them around and so they wouldn't be lost. And so fragments were found, articles, books were found, and they were all collected in one volume or in one collection by this Roman editor named Andronicus. And Andronicus tried to categorize these selections, these fragments, as best he could. And so he would put some works together and put them in a classification of logical works or logical terms. And he would take other works and he would say, well, these appear to deal primarily just with physical things. Just as an aside, Aristotle wrote a lot about antlers and a lot of information just dealing with biology. And so those were fairly easy to categorize. And so, for example, you can pick up a volume of Aristotle's today that's just referred to as the Physics. And it's not his physics in a sense in which we might use it in a college setting today. Not that kind of physics. It just means, again, going back to that original meaning in the Greek, dealing with physical sorts of things. Well, Andronicus had a hard time dealing with some other fragments. For example, Aristotle talked about this unmoved mover, and that didn't fit really well into any of the other categories that he had had previously. It didn't fit well into any of the other volumes that he was trying to put together. And so Andronicus said, well, perhaps the best thing to do is for me just to put all these other works after the physical works. And so there's a volume after the physical works that's referred to as the Metataphysica, which when we kind of pare that down to English just means metaphysics. So this term, this word metaphysics that we think is so highbrow, in reality just means, well, these are the works that Andronicus couldn't put anywhere else, and so he just put them after the physical works. So the first thing you need to realize is that even though these words may sound intimidating, they're really not. And actually, they're sometimes more confusing once you understand their original meaning than before. But perhaps it's not a real confusing term or a real confusing word to use, because as I said before, meta can mean after, it can also mean beyond. So metaphysica or metaphysics can mean after the physical, it can also mean beyond the physical, and that's a good way to talk about metaphysics, because metaphysics does deal with that which lies beyond the physical. When I'm talking about, for example, the existence of God or the existence of angels or spirit or incorporeal beings, beings that don't have bodies, I'm dealing with those things that are beyond the physical, and that's a metaphysical issue. What I don't want you to do is to think that metaphysics deals solely with those things that deal with beyond the physical. Metaphysics is a very broad term. Metaphysics refers to anything that exists. If, for example, I ask the question, what kind of a being am I? That's a metaphysical question, even though I'm a physical being. So metaphysics deals with beyond the physical. It also deals with the physical because it's simply the study of reality. So if I say, does God exist? If so, what is God's nature? If I say, what am I? What is my nature? What is the nature of the universe? If I say, does the universe exist as a mind-independent reality, as Berkeley would? Those are all metaphysical kinds of questions. Questions dealing with God, the universe, and humanity, with their reality and their nature, are all metaphysical in nature. A term or a word that's sometimes used interchangeably with metaphysics is ontology, and you'll want to use that word as well, or at least be familiar with it. Ontos is the Greek participle for to be, so literally ontology is the study of being. And so hopefully you can see why sometimes metaphysics is used interchangeably with ontology or ontological. If I deal with something's metaphysical status, the way in which it exists as a real thing, I'm also dealing with in what way it be, its ontological status. So it's an ontic question, for example, to say what kind of entity, what kind of an object is this table? In what way does it exist? It's very important later on in the semester, for example, when we talk about the issue of abortion, when we talk about an ethical issue, that we realize that ethics is oftentimes related to metaphysical or ontological issues. For example, many people would say that before we can answer the question, can someone have an abortion, we need to answer the question, well, what kind of thing, what kind of being, what kind of ontology, what kind of being is the fetus? So you need to determine the ontological status of the fetus before you can determine its moral status. So you will see the word ontology used periodically through the semester. Know that it's used interchangeably with metaphysics. In reality, metaphysics is a much broader area. Most individuals probably would say that ontology deals solely with the existence of a thing, whereas metaphysics deals with its existence as well as its nature. The next major field or major branch of philosophy is epistemology. Again, another term that's Greek in origin. Epistemi means to know or I know. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. In this area, what you would ask would be questions like, is knowledge possible? What's the difference between knowledge and belief or knowledge and opinion? If I can know something, how is that knowledge acquired? Do I come to know things about the universe by simply knowing the mind or simply using the mind? Or do I access or know things about the universe by experience, by sensation? What's the relationship between those sorts of questions? Those would be epistemic or epistemological questions. We're going to spend a major segment, a major portion of our time dealing with issues of epistemology as well. The third branch of philosophy is axiology, another Greek term, axios, which means deserving or worthy. Things are deserving or worthy if they have value. And so axiology is the study of value. And we could talk about the value of anything and have that be an axiological discussion. I could, for example, talk about, well, what is it that makes a desk valuable? Not in a monetary or in a financial sense, but what is it about desks that we value? What makes one desk better than another desk? What are the kinds of characteristics or features that need to be in existence before we can say that a desk has a certain amount of value? You could write a book about that. I doubt very many individuals would purchase that text because most people would say that you need to talk about a specific kind of value when you're talking about something being axiological. Typically, axiology is broken down into various subfields or branches itself. Probably the most major field of axiology is ethics. When you deal with ethics, you're dealing with an axiological issue. When, for example, I say that you should help your neighbor across the street, or you should be kind, or you shouldn't hit your neighbor with a 2x4, what I'm doing is I'm ranking behavior. I'm saying that some behavior is better or higher than other behaviors. If you rank or if you have a hierarchy of behavior, what you're doing is you're saying that some have more value than another. And that's why ethics is listed as a subfield of axiology, because you're dealing with placing a value on behavior, action, and even thought. Other subfields of axiology would include disciplines like aesthetics. In aesthetics, for example, you talk about the study of beauty or art. You ask questions like, well, what makes this piece of literature better than this piece of literature? Or why is this sculpture better than another? Why do the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci count for more than the paintings of my sons that I put on my refrigerator? What makes those paintings better than mine? Most individuals, or a lot of individuals, would say that there's something objective about those sorts of questions, that it's not merely a case of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that you can make a ranking or you can say that this person's artwork is better than somebody else's artwork. If that's the case, then you're putting a value on those things, and you're saying that there is a means by which we can determine the value of beauty and art. We could talk about social and political philosophy, what makes one form of government better than another one. Again, when we use terms like better than or worse than or greater or lesser, you're ranking things and you're dealing with value. Even asking the question, does my life have meaning? Many people would say, well, that's directly related to the notion of, do I have value? Am I a valuable being? So that also would be a subfield of axiology. So we've discussed metaphysics, the study of reality, three major areas, the existence and nature of God, the universe, and humanity. Epistemology, the study of knowledge, what do I know, what does it mean to know, how much is knowable, how do I acquire knowledge, and axiology, the study of value, also having subfields like ethics, aesthetics, social political philosophy, the meaning of life. The last major branch in philosophy is logic. you'll notice that at the end of a couple of those words that we've looked at previously, and really at the end of a lot of terms that you probably encounter in a college environment, you'll see LOGY, psychology, sociology, anthropology, epistemology, axiology. All of those terms end in LOGY, and they come from that same Greek root word logos, from which we get the word logic, which is our fourth standard branch in philosophy. Logic is kind of like the Hawaiian aloha. It kind of can mean just about anything. Most specifically, the word logos or logos means word, but it can also mean story, account, rationale, study, and it's in that context that we have things like psychology and sociology. It's a study of those things. Axiology, a study of value. Epistemology, a study of knowledge. Logic itself is the study of reason or rationality. This is obviously not going to be something that we're going to be studying at just one point in this class. Hopefully, what we're going to be doing is talking logically about every one of these standard branches in philosophy. And that's really the next important thing that you need to know about these branches is that they're all interrelated. I touched on this before when I said that it would be impossible for us to spend a certain amount of time just talking about one specific issue. At this point, I need to really key in on that and demonstrate, or at least point out, that it's impossible to talk about any of these issues independently of the others. The most important of which is logic. We want to deal logically with every one of these disciplines. If we're studying knowledge, for example, or epistemology, we don't want to say, well, we've studied logic, now we can just talk about knowledge. We want to study knowledge rationally. We want to look at it logically. We want to look at it reasonably. The same thing goes with respect to metaphysical issues being related to other issues. For example, if I talk about the existence of God, that's going to have far-reaching ramifications for logic and epistemology and axiology. For example, a lot of people would say that I need to first of all ask the question, can I know whether or not God exists? Well, that's an epistemic question. That's a question of epistemology. Another individual might say, well, if I can determine that God exists, that has a far-reaching ramifications for ethics or for morality. Dostoevsky, for example, said numerous times in The Brothers Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permissible or everything is permitted. And a lot of people have echoed that sentiment. Well, if that's true, then that means that if I can determine that God exists, then that perhaps says something to say about morality. Or if God does not exist, that says something about ethics or morality. So if God exists, that has far-reaching ramifications for axiology, for ethics, for the meaning of life. It also would probably have far-reaching ramifications for issues in other areas like epistemology, or even issues in logic. A lot of individuals would say that you could ground the rules of logic in God. That's just one example of how one issue would have a far-reaching ramification or consequence in other issues. The two twin towers of philosophy are sometimes deemed to be epistemology and metaphysics. And here I think is perhaps the best example of how all branches of philosophy are intertwined. When we get to the section on metaphysics, we're going to see immediately that it's impossible to talk about what there is without coming to know something about, well, how is it that we know what there is? You can't do metaphysics without doing epistemology. Likewise, you can't do epistemology. You can't talk about what it is to know without talking about what it is that you're knowing. Knowledge is always what philosophers would refer to as intentional. It's always about something or directed to something. You know something. That's a metaphysical issue, something. It's ontological status. And so all these areas are interrelated. You can't talk about one without talking about the others. The other thing that you need to know about philosophy is that philosophy also talks about not just what can be known and what is in terms of metaphysics and what is of value and how to think, which a lot of people would think, well, that probably covers just about everything. It also covers every other discipline. There is, for example, what is known in philosophy as a second-order study, or philosophy oftentimes takes the part or plays the role of a second-order study. You have a philosophy of X, a philosophy of blank, whatever it might be. You have a philosophy of law, a philosophy of education, a philosophy of religion, a philosophy of history. What that means is that philosophy has a hand not simply in the major branches of philosophy, it also has a hand in every other discipline too. If, for example, you open up an introductory level textbook in your science class and you read just the first chapter, chances are you're not reading anything that has anything at all to do with science. You're reading a philosophy of science. In that first chapter, the scientist who's writing the textbook, or the philosopher of science who's writing that first chapter, is going to say, this is how scientists go about their craft. This is what takes place. This is how science is done. This is how hypothesis, theory, formation, and testing takes place, and why we think that it delivers truth. They will tell you things like, we conduct our tests over and over and over again. We believe that the best method is through the scientific method in terms of how to acquire knowledge. And so we confirm our information, that we formulate a hypothesis, that we then test it to see whether or not it's either verified or falsified. We share our data or our results in an equitable or a fair manner with our colleagues throughout the world by publishing scholarly articles or by writing textbooks. That's all philosophical. That's not scientific. And by that I mean it's not unrelated to science, but that it's primarily philosophical in nature. You don't do science to find out how you do science. At no point in the history of science did a scientist ever mix two chemicals in some kind of a beaker, kind of swirl the chemicals around and look in the bottom and see kind of form in the substrate of that chemical process, conduct your experiments multiple times, or share your data fairly or equitably with your fellow colleagues. Those are ethical issues. Those are issues concerned with truth. Those are issues concerned with what we think delivers knowledge. Those are issues concerned with what we think is real. In other words, they are logical, axiological, epistemological, and metaphysical issues. Same thing goes with education, with justice, with religion. Questions that are second-order questions are questions about questions. A scientist says, why does this happen? A philosopher of science says, why do you ask the question, why does this happen? Or what do you mean when you ask that question? What are your starting points? What are your presuppositions? Why do you do philosophy? Why do you do science the way you do science? Why do we have an educational system the way that we have it? Why do we think that our current justice system is the preferred justice system? When you ask those sorts of questions, you're not asking questions of those disciplines per se. Within the disciplines, you're asking them from outside. You're asking them from a philosophical vantage point. And so what I'm trying to get across now at this point is that not only does philosophy discuss the fundamental issues in terms of reality, knowledge, value, and reason, it also has a hand in actually serving as the starting point for every other discipline. And perhaps that's why Pythagoras thought that everybody ought to be a philosopher and first described himself as a philosopher, because in some sense all disciplines spring out of philosophy. If you take a course from anybody else here at Chattanooga State, what you'll probably encounter is someone with a PhD. Well, what is a PhD? A PhD is a doctorate in philosophy. Someone who has an advanced degree, a doctoral degree in mathematics, has a doctoral degree primarily in philosophy, because mathematics is a subfield of philosophy. Most specifically, it is a subfield of logic. If someone has an advanced degree or a doctorate in physics, they have a PhD. Why? Again, because they have a doctorate in philosophy. They're dealing primarily with issues of metaphysics. They're talking about reality, and just a small part of reality. They're dealing with the universe and the way in which it exists in our relationship to it. But that's just as philosophical as what we're going to be talking about in this class. So understand that philosophy is far-reaching. The beard does not the philosopher make, but again, more importantly, we need to understand that it does bake bread, that we're doing something fundamental here, because even in those other disciplines where you think that you're doing something tangible, you're doing philosophy there as well. The scope of philosophy is universal. The next thing that we need to discuss quickly is the notion of the major approaches to philosophy. Most philosophers would say that there are two major approaches to philosophy. One approach is known as a speculative approach. The speculative approach in philosophy says that the major problems of philosophy are genuine problems. In other words, these are legitimate questions that we're asking that have legitimate or genuine answers, even if we disagree as to the nature of those answers. For example, a speculative philosopher, someone like Plato or Kant or Hume or Descartes or Kierkegaard, perhaps Kierkegaard would be put in another category, but I think a case could be made that he'd be a speculative philosopher as well. Any of the medieval scholars like Augustine or Aquinas, they would ask questions like, does God exist? And they would say, even if we disagree amongst ourselves as to whether or not God does exist, we're all in agreement that that's a legitimate question to ask. And there's an answer to that question. It's either yes or no. So most philosophers in the history of philosophy have been speculative philosophers, speculating with respect to specific issues, and all in agreement that there are answers to those questions and that they should be asked, that they're genuine questions to be asked. Other philosophers think that the problems of philosophy are probably really just pseudo-problems, that they're not really real, and that the questions that we're asking in philosophy are not real problems, and that therefore there aren't really answers out there. These are known as analytic philosophers. They would include philosophers like A.J. Ayer or Wittgenstein. individuals who would believe that the problems of philosophy are really problems of linguistic confusion. For example, an analytic philosopher would say that the question, does God exist, is a meaningless question. And therefore, the answer is not to be an atheist or a theist or an agnostic. It's to understand that the questions of philosophy, or the questions that are oftentimes asked, are really problems of language. They're not really problems that have true answers to them. I'm going to be taking the approach primarily in this class that we're going to be approaching this from a speculative perspective. To be honest with you, I think I'd be wasting my time if the questions of philosophy weren't true, genuine questions that didn't have genuine answers to them. And so I'm going to be taking the approach of the speculative philosopher, but I did want to let you know that there are other approaches to philosophy. And that's not to say that there's nothing good to be gained from approaching perhaps some disciplines from an analytic perspective. There are some questions in philosophy that it would be helpful to understand, well, what is the nature of the question that we're asking? And sometimes the questions are pseudo-questions. Sometimes the problems are pseudo-problems, not real problems. And of course, there are other approaches to philosophy as well. An existential approach, I mentioned Kierkegaard earlier. He might fit better in this area. You could take a phenomenological approach. You could take a pragmatic approach to philosophy. They're out there. We'll touch on them perhaps briefly, but the main approach that we're taking in this class will be speculative. The next thing that you need to know for purposes of this class would be the historical periods in philosophy. Now, I wish someone would have spent some time talking to me when I was an undergraduate student with respect to the major historical fields in philosophy, because it really goes a long way to helping you understand where philosophers fit in the history of philosophy, and it gives you almost a heads up in terms of what they're going to be talking about even before you read anything about them. If you know where a philosopher fits, you can get a pretty good indication about what they're going to be concerned with and how they're going to write. There are 4 historical periods in philosophy. The first historical period in philosophy is known as the ancient or classical period. This would cover individuals like Socrates and the pre-Socratics, those who predated Socrates. It would cover individuals like Plato and Aristotle. It would cover the Epicureans, for example, individuals that were primarily confined to ancient Greece. In other words, we're talking about a time period that runs from about the 6th century BC to around the 3rd century AD. The next time period in philosophy runs from about the 4th century AD to right around the 16th century AD, a huge time period. Immediately you should be struck by the fact that we're dealing with a lot of years here. And that's why it's aptly named as the Dark Ages, or medieval time periods, or the scholastic time period. Here we have individuals like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, St. Anselm. You should be picking up on a theme here. In classical or ancient philosophy, they dealt primarily with metaphysical concepts. They dealt primarily with questions dealing with nature. Socrates broadened that to some extent. It wasn't until the time of Socrates that you had individuals dealing with things in ethics, for example, and answering questions, or at least trying to answer questions of justice or beauty, and dealing even with issues of logic that was developed by Aristotle. But when you get to medieval or scholastic philosophy, what you have is almost a Christianization, from a Western perspective anyway, of ancient or classical philosophy. For example, there's a direct link between St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. As a matter of fact, about 1/4 of the works of St. Thomas Aquinas is just a quoting of Aristotle. He doesn't even refer to Aristotle by name. He holds him in such high regard and high respect that he actually refers to Aristotle as the philosopher. He just assumes everybody's going to know who he's talking about. So much of Aristotle's work was incorporated into Aquinas' work. And Aquinas' work can be in many ways seen or deemed as a Christianization of Aristotle's philosophy. There's also a link between St. Augustine and Plato. Much of Augustine's work can be deemed or interpreted as being Platonic or heavily influenced by the works of Plato. So if I say someone in this class is a scholastic philosopher, immediately you should know that these are individuals who lived sometime between the 4th and 16th century, and most likely they're writing from a Christian perspective, at least from Western philosophy's perspective. And most likely what they're going to be doing is they're going to be patching up holes in what they see as some of the missing elements in ancient or classical philosophy, either borrowing heavily from Aristotle or borrowing heavily from Plato. The next period in philosophy is known as the modern period in philosophy. That covers people like Descartes and Leibniz and Locke and Kant. 17th and 18th century, very short time period. A lot was going on during this time period, primarily in the field or in the area of epistemology. These individuals were engaged in what's known in the philosophical world as the epistemic shift in philosophy. There was a shift from dealing with metaphysical issues in ancient and medieval philosophy to issues in epistemology. People like Leibniz and Kant and Hume and Locke and Descartes were all concerned with how do we know? They thought there's so much that's wrong in previous philosophy, and the reason why they got it wrong was because they started off doing metaphysics first, talking about what is, and then trying to find out how it was that they came to know that information. Well, before you can know what is, you have to know how you know. And so if you pick up a book that was written in the 17th and 18th century by a philosopher, most likely it's going to be dealing with epistemology. Again, another heads up for later on in the semester. The final period in philosophy is known just as contemporary philosophy. It runs from 19th century to the present. Here's where we have an emphasis on various approaches to philosophy. Existentialism, pragmatism, analytic philosophy really comes to the fore in contemporary philosophy. So for here, you would include philosophers like Wittgenstein and Ayer and Russell and Plantinga and James and Dewey and Peirce. The list goes on and on. If you keep this historical breakdown in mind as you go along, I think that'll be very helpful as the semester progresses. A couple final comments before we end here today. The first one, how do we respond to the issue of are there any limits to philosophy? Many individuals would say it appears like there really are no limits to philosophy. Philosophy discusses just about everything. If it's not reality, knowledge, logic, and value, it also discusses the presuppositions, the foundation, the starting point of every other discipline. Well, we're actually going to have to hold off in answering that question until later on, after we get a little further into logic. But keep that in the back of your mind as we go along. What do you think? Are there any limits to what philosophy can address? Or is philosophy almost a catch-all for everything that can possibly be examined or evaluated? And then finally, some general recommendations for the semester. In terms of your reading, I don't want anybody to be bogged down with the corresponding reading for this course. Keep in mind that although we've been doing philosophy all along, if we've been asking fundamental questions, you probably haven't been reading philosophical texts or philosophical works. For the most part, you can almost think of philosophy as dealing with a new language set. Until you get a handle on questions or issues of epistemology or metaphysics or even remember what those terms are, it'll be somewhat difficult. Perhaps the best thing that I can say in terms of a general recommendation is that if you get lost, feel free to reread the material more than once. That's oftentimes the best thing that someone can do, especially after you watch the lecture. And keep in mind that you can always view this video more than once. And with that, we'll bring things to a close for today and begin with a discussion of logic in our next video.